Welcome. You've found the perfect place to rest for the night. But before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can all settle in and let the story carry us into a peaceful sleep. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, let's fall asleep together. The storm rolled in heavy and dark, the kind of storm that seemed to carry the weight of something ancient and restless. Rain hammered down on the thatched roofs of the crumbling keep, slipping between the cracks in the stone and soaking through the threadbare blankets in the servants' quarters. Somewhere deep within the castle, the dying cough of Willen's father echoed down the empty halls. Willen sat cross-legged by the cold hearth, hands wrapped around his knees. He was 12 years old, but his eyes were older. His father, Lord Markal, had once stood tall among the knights of Avaloria, a man of legend who fought alongside the king himself. But that was before the duel, before his honor had been stripped from him, his land seized, and his name spoken only in whispers. "Come closer, boy," his father rasped from the bed. Willen hesitated before crossing the room, kneeling beside the bed. His father's hand, thin, almost skeletal, reached out and cupped the back of his head. His breath smelled of sickness. "You must survive," his father whispered. "Your name will rise again, but you must be strong." Tears burned at the corners of Willen's eyes. He wanted to say something, to ask why his father had lost the duel, why the king had turned against them, why their once great house had crumbled to this, but the words wouldn't come. His father's hand slipped from his neck. His chest rose sharply once, twice, and then went still. The rain outside seemed to fade into silence. A week later, Willen stood beneath a gray sky as the knights carried his father's body into the earth. A small procession of servants and low-born villagers gathered, but no nobles, no men in shining armor. His father had died a disgraced man, and disgrace clung to his name like rot. "You have nothing now," said Lord Edric, stepping up behind him. Edric was a tall man, cold-eyed, wrapped in the red and gold cloak of the king's council. His mouth curled into something that almost looked like a smile. "You'll come with me," Edric said. "You'll serve as a squire in my court. Perhaps one day you'll be of use to the king, if you learn to keep your head down." Willen didn't want to follow him, but he had no choice. Years passed. Willen trained harder than any other squire. While the sons of noble houses sat in silk tunics by the fire, he sparred until his hands bled. While the other squires laughed and drank, he cleaned the stables and practiced his sword forms beneath the cold moonlight. He endured the sneers and the whispers. The others called him the ghost's son, a reminder of his father's disgrace. But Willen held his tongue and sharpened his blade. He told himself that one day he would rise above them all. One night, while tending to the stables, Willen heard a sound, the sharp thud of hooves in the courtyard. He slipped into the shadows and watched as two knights rode through the gate. One of them slumped in the saddle, barely holding the reins. The man's armor was cracked, stained dark with blood. His cloak was gray and silver, marked with the ancient sigil of the Silver Order, an order that had been thought extinct for a century. The other knight helped him down from the saddle, and Willen saw the deep gash across his side. The knight's breath came shallow, his eyes half-lidded. "Help!" shouted the other knight. "Fetch the healer!" But Willen moved first. He ran to the knight's side and caught him before he hit the ground. The knight's eyes fluttered open. His hand, gloved in gray leather, seized Willen's wrist. The strength in that grip was terrifying. "You must take it," the knight whispered. "What?" The knight's hand slipped to his side and pulled free a broken sword, half of its blade missing, the steel etched with runes that glowed faintly silver beneath the moonlight. "Take it," the knight hissed. "The silver flame. We'll choose its heir." Willen stared down at the sword. His hand trembled as he reached for it, but the moment his fingers touched the hilt, the runes blazed to life. A silver light burned beneath his skin, spreading from his hand through his arm up into his chest. His breath hitched. The knight smiled faintly. "The light has chosen," he said, before his body slackened. The sword pulsed in Willen's hand. His heart hammered beneath his ribs. From the shadows of the courtyard, Lord Edric stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on the sword. "What have you done?" Edric's voice was sharp. Willen stood, the sword still glowing faintly in his hand. His knuckles tightened around the hilt. The light had chosen him. And somehow, Willen knew that his life would never be the same. The sword still glowed faintly in Willen's hand as he stood beneath the torchlight. The cold wind of the courtyard brushed against his skin, carrying the scent of rain and horse sweat. The dead knight's body lay at his feet, but Willen's eyes were fixed on Lord Edric. Edric's gaze narrowed, sharp and calculating. His crimson cloak stirred behind him. The firelight reflected off the polished black steel of his armor. "Give me the sword," Edric said, stepping forward. His voice was calm, measured, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. Willen tightened his grip on the hilt. The sword pulsed beneath his fingers, the runes etched along the blade's edge flickering with soft silver light. It felt alive. It was as though the sword could feel his fear, his uncertainty, and it was feeding on it. "It chose me," Willen said, though his voice was quieter than he'd intended. Edric's lips curled into a thin smile. "It's just a sword. You are not of the Silver Order. You have no claim to it." He took another step forward. "Give it to me, boy." Willen's chest tightened. He didn't understand why, but the idea of handing over the sword felt wrong. His feet were already moving backward. "No," he said. Edric's expression darkened. His hand fell to the hilt of his own sword. "You would refuse your lord?" The sword's pulse quickened beneath Willen's hand. "I'm not your servant," Willen said. "Not anymore." Edric's hand shot toward his sword, but the silver blade in Willen's grip flared with light, and Edric flinched. Willen turned and ran. He didn't know where he was going. His feet pounded against the rain-soaked ground as he raced toward the edge of the courtyard. Behind him he heard shouting. The guards were already stirring. He darted down a side corridor and climbed the low wall of the outer gate. His heart hammered in his chest. His palms burned where they touched the sword's hilt, but he didn't dare let go. Willen slipped into the cover of the trees beyond the castle walls and kept running until the torches of the keep disappeared into the night. He collapsed beneath the dark boughs of a pine tree, chest heaving. The sword lay across his lap, still faintly glowing. He studied it beneath the moonlight. The runes flickered dimly. Along the base of the blade he recognized ancient script, the language of the old gods. He had seen those markings carved into the ruined stones of the eastern monasteries. "The light will rise from the last blood." The word stirred something in his chest, but he didn't know why. Footsteps crunched on the forest floor. Willen's breath caught. He scrambled to his feet, raising the sword. A figure stepped into the clearing, tall and slender, with a glint of moonlight on a drawn bow. "Easy," said a woman's voice. "I'm not here to kill you. Yet." She lowered the bow and stepped forward. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, and her eyes gleamed pale green beneath the hood of her cloak. She wore hunting leathers, and a long silver dagger hung from her belt. "Who are you?" Willen demanded. "Evelyn," she said. Her gaze swept over him and the sword. "I saw the light. Figured I'd investigate." Willen lowered the sword, his breath still ragged. "I don't need help." Evelyn's mouth curled. "Oh, I think you do." From the trees behind her, a low growl rumbled. Evelyn's hand shot to her dagger. Willen spun toward the sound. Shadows stirred at the edge of the clearing, long, sinewy shapes slithering between the trees. Two glowing yellow eyes blinked from the darkness. Then another pair, and another. 3 massive wolves stepped into the moonlight. Their bodies were too large, their fur too black. Smoke curled from their open jaws. Willen's heart seized. Shadow beasts. The wolves spread out, circling them. Evelyn crouched, drawing her dagger. I thought these things were wiped out centuries ago. They were. One of the wolves lunged. Willen threw himself to the side. His back hit the forest floor as black jaws snapped where his throat had been. The wolf's eyes flashed. The sword pulsed. Willen rolled to his feet, raising the sword as the wolf lunged again. The silver blade flared with sudden light. He swung, and the blade sliced through the wolf's throat. The creature collapsed in a burst of smoke and ash. The other 2 wolves howled and charged. Evelyn moved fast. Her dagger caught one across the face, but it didn't slow. Willen drove his sword into the side of the second wolf. The blade burned with silver light, and the creature howled as it dissolved into shadow. The last wolf hesitated, then growled and retreated into the woods. Willen stood, chest heaving. Smoke curled from the edge of the blade. Evelyn wiped blood from her dagger with a leather cloth. "Well," she said, breathless, "you've got talent." Willen's gaze lingered on the sword. "It's not me." Evelyn smirked. "Modesty's cute, but I think you'll need more than a magic sword to survive what's coming." Willen frowned. "What do you mean?" Evelyn turned toward the dark edge of the woods. "There's a man in the city of Willen, a warlock named Oren. If you want to understand why that sword chose you, you'll need to find him." Willen hesitated. "And what do you want?" Evelyn's pale green eyes flashed. "I'm coming with you." "Why?" She smiled faintly. "You think you're the only one with a score to settle?" Willen glanced down at the sword. The runes still pulsed beneath his fingers. "All right," he said. "Willen, then." Evelyn sheathed her dagger. "Try to keep up." She disappeared into the trees. Willen followed. The light of the sword burned steady in his hand as he walked toward the dark horizon. Willen was nothing like Willen had imagined. The city sprawled across the rocky cliffs like a beast sleeping beneath the shadow of the mountains. Narrow streets twisted down into dark alleys, and the sound of hammers striking anvils echoed through the air. The buildings were a mixture of old stone and weathered timber, built so close together that the upper floors leaned over the streets below. Thick smoke curled from the chimneys, blending with the salty breeze that rolled in from the sea. Willen and Evelyn stood at the edge of the city gates. Behind them, the long road they had traveled stretched back into the gray mist of the forest. Before them, the streets of Willen pulsed with noise. Merchants hawking goods, beggars clutching at the hems of passing cloaks, the ring of steel from the city's many forges. "Well," Evelyn said, scanning the crowd, "we're not exactly dressed for the occasion." Willen glanced down at himself. His clothes were torn from the journey, stained with mud and smoke. The sword, the silver flame, was strapped to his back beneath his cloak. He could still feel its weight pressing between his shoulder blades like a heartbeat. "We're not here for a party," Willen said. Evelyn's eyes glinted. "That's where you're wrong." She pulled a thin scrap of parchment from the inside of her cloak and handed it to him. Willen unfolded it and read the bolded ink. "The Tournament of Kings. Open Challenge. All knights, squires, and men of honor are called to compete for the favor of the crown. Champion's prize, a place among the king's guard, and the blessing of the gods." Willen frowned. "We don't have time for this." Evelyn leaned in, her voice low. "If you want to get an audience with Oren, you're going to need influence, and nothing earns influence faster than winning a tournament." Willen sighed. He already knew where this was going. "And let me guess," he said, "you expect me to win it?" Evelyn smiled. "The sword chose you, didn't it?" The tournament was held at the base of the western cliffs, a vast ring of packed dirt surrounded by wooden stands and colorful banners fluttering in the salty wind. Knights in shining armor lined the field, mounted on war horses with gilded barding. Squires carried swords and lances. Willen stood at the edge of the grounds, feeling painfully out of place. His borrowed armor was battered and a size too large. His horse was thin and skittish. Evelyn, standing at his side, leaned close and adjusted the strap of his helmet. "Relax," she said. "You'll only be fighting trained knights who've spent their entire lives preparing for this." Willen shot her a look. "I'm joking," she added, "mostly." A fanfare of horns cut through the chatter of the crowd. A tall figure in silver and blue robes stepped onto the raised platform overlooking the arena. His black hair was streaked with gray, and a heavy golden chain sat across his shoulders. "The King of Avaloria," Evelyn whispered. Behind the king stood another man, lean, dressed in black armor. His cloak was crimson. His sharp, pale eyes swept across the field, cold and calculating. Willen's blood ran cold. "Edric," he muttered. Evelyn's gaze sharpened. "Friend of yours?" "Not exactly." The king raised his hand for silence. "Knights of Avaloria," his voice carried across the field. "Today, you fight not only for glory, but for the favor of the crown." A cheer rose from the stands. "Begin!" The first round was over quickly. Willen faced a young knight with gold-trimmed armor and a polished steel blade. The knight lunged forward at fast, trained, but Willen's reflexes were sharper. He sidestepped the blow and brought his sword down hard against the knight's shield. The impact sent the boy sprawling into the dirt. The crowd gasped. Willen lowered the sword. The runes along the blade's edge flickered, but the silver light remained dormant. He left the knight gasping on the ground and walked back toward the sidelines. "Well done," Evelyn said. "One down." The second round was harder. His opponent was older, stronger, a knight from the northern provinces. He fought with heavy, brutal strikes, forcing Willen onto the defensive. Willen blocked a blow that sent him stumbling to his knees. The older knight's sword came down in a flash of steel. But Willen rolled to the side and brought his blade up, cutting across the knight's armored thigh. The silver light flared along the blade's edge. The knight cried out and dropped to his knees. Willen stood over him, breathing hard. The crowd roared. By the final round, Willen's limbs ached, and his breath came ragged. His opponent stood across from him at the edge of the ring, tall and broad-shouldered beneath a suit of dark steel. His face was hidden behind a black helm marked with a crimson crest. Edric's knight. The man lowered his visor and drew his sword. It was longer than Willen's, black steel carved with jagged runes. Willen lifted the silver flame. The blade pulsed in his hands. The knight charged. Their swords met with a clash that shook Willen's bones. He slid back beneath the weight of the blow. The knight pressed forward, his blade striking like a hammer against Willen's defenses. Willen ducked beneath a blow and rolled to the side, but the knight was faster. His boot slammed into Willen's chest, driving him to the ground. The knight's sword hovered at Willen's throat. From the stands, Edric watched with cold amusement. Willen gritted his teeth. "You have been chosen." The silver flame pulsed beneath his fingers. The knight lunged, and Willen rolled to the side. He swung upward, fast, and the silver blade burned with sudden white light as it struck the knight's sword. The black steel shattered with a sound like breaking glass. The crowd went dead silent. Willen stood over the fallen knight. His heart thundered beneath his ribs. The silver flame pulsed bright and steady in his hand. The king stood slowly from his seat. His gaze lingered on the sword. Edric's eyes narrowed. His mouth curled into a thin smile. "Well," Evelyn said, stepping up behind Willen, "looks like you've got their attention." Willen's grip tightened around the sword's hilt. And somehow, he knew, this was only the beginning. Willen stood at the edge of the cliffs overlooking the sea. The salt spray clung to his skin as the dark waves crashed below. A thin line of mist curled along the horizon, and beyond it lay the Shadowlands, the cursed realm where the Shadow King's power had been growing unchecked for centuries. The silver flame pulsed faintly beneath his hand, the runes along the blade's edge flickering with cold light. He had won the tournament. He had proven himself before the king and the nobles of Avaloria. And yet, the weight in his chest remained. Behind him, Evelyn approached. She stopped beside him, her cloak rustling in the sharp breeze. "You haven't slept," she said. Willen shook his head. "I can feel it. The Shadow King's power. It's growing stronger." Evelyn's gaze hardened. "Then we stop him before he crosses into Avaloria." Willen's jaw tightened. He could feel the power of the silver flame stirring beneath his skin, growing louder since the tournament. But with that power came something darker, a whisper at the edge of his mind. "The light will rise from the last blood." "I don't know if I'm strong enough," Willen said. Evelyn stepped closer. "The sword chose you." "I don't know why." "Then maybe it's time to find out." They left Caer Valen before dawn. Willen, Evelyn, Goran, and Alric. A small company of knights followed them, some of the best in Avaloria, but Willen could sense the tension beneath their polished armor. The Shadowlands were cursed ground. The road wound through blackened fields and jagged hills. The air grew colder the farther they traveled. Frost crept across the ground beneath the horses' hooves, even though it was still autumn. "We're being watched," Evelyn murmured. Willen glanced toward the tree line. Shapes lingered in the fog, dark figures with hollow eyes. "Shades," Goran growled. Willen slid the silver flame from its sheath. The light pulsed, casting a pale glow across the ground. The shades retreated deeper into the fog. "They fear the blade," Alric said, his eyes glinting beneath his hood. "Interesting." "They should," Willen said. They rode through the fog until the dark silhouette of the Shadowlands rose before them, a black ridge of stone curling upward like the spine of a dead beast. Beyond it, the ruins of an ancient fortress stood against the gray sky. "Blackthorn Keep," Evelyn said. Willen's stomach twisted. "It's empty?" Evelyn's expression darkened. "It should be." They approached the gate, black iron, twisted and broken. Willen pushed it open, and the sound of rusted metal scraping stone echoed through the fog. The keep's courtyard was empty, but the shadows beneath the towers seemed too thick. Wrong. "Spread out," Willen ordered. The knights moved through the ruins. Goran's heavy steps echoed against the stone. Evelyn kept her bow raised, her eyes sharp. "Stay close," Willen said. They crossed the courtyard and entered the great hall. The roof had collapsed long ago, leaving the chamber open to the gray sky. Torn banners hung from the broken columns. At the far end of the hall stood a raised platform, and on it, a figure in black armor sat on a stone throne. "Is it him?" Alric whispered. Willen's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. "No." The figure's helm tilted upward. A soft chuckle echoed through the hall. "Welcome," said Lord Edric. Willen stepped forward. His boots scraped against the stone. "Edric," he said, "you shouldn't be here." Edric smiled thinly beneath his helm. "And yet, here I am." Goran stepped beside Willen, his hand on the hilt of his hammer. "This place is cursed. You have no claim to it." Edric's gaze swept lazily across the room. "No claim?" Dark shapes flickered at the edges of the hall, shades curling upward from the broken stone. "They serve me now," Edric said. Willen's heart clenched. "What have you done?" Edric rose from the throne. "The Shadow King's power is not a gift. It's a bargain, and I have paid the price." He lifted his hand. Dark fire curled between his fingers. "You sided with him?" Willen said. Edric's eyes glinted beneath the helm. "You think Avaloria will survive this war with honor alone? Strength, that's what matters. The Shadow King's power will reshape this world, and I intend to stand beside him when it happens." "You betrayed the king," Willen said. "I saved Avaloria," Edric said. "And when the dust settles, I will rule what remains." "You're wrong." Edric's smile darkened. "Am I?" He lowered his hand. The shades lunged forward. The first one struck Goran from behind, claws cutting deep into his shoulder. Goran roared and swung his hammer, crushing the shade beneath its weight. "Hold the line!" Willen shouted. Evelyn's arrow streaked through the air, piercing a shade through the chest. It dissolved into black smoke, but more of them were rising from the stone. Willen raised the silver flame. Light exploded outward, cutting through the nearest shades. His sword danced, moving almost on its own. He felt the power beneath the blade, sharp and cold. Edric watched from the platform, his dark gaze burned. "You've improved," Edric said, "but not enough." He drew his sword, a black blade etched with red runes, a twin to the Shadow King's weapon. Edric stepped down from the platform. His blade hissed through the air. Willen met the blow with the silver flame, steel against steel. The ground beneath them trembled. Edric moved fast, faster than Willen had expected. The black sword cut toward his side, but Willen deflected the strike and drove his knee into Edric's chest. Edric staggered back. His eyes narrowed. "You think you can win?" Edric said. Willen stepped forward, his blade raised. "I know I can." Edric's smile widened. The black sword struck forward. Willen blocked, but too late. The edge of the blade cut across his side. He stumbled, breath hitching, as pain burned through him. Edric's sword came down. Willen caught it with the silver flame, and silver light erupted between them. The runes along Willen's blade blazed. Edric's eyes widened. "No!" Willen drove the silver flame forward, hard, and light erupted from the point of the blade. Edric's armor shattered. His body hit the ground. Willen stood over him, breathless. Edric's eyes glinted beneath his shattered helm. His mouth twisted into something almost like a smile. "You still don't understand," Edric whispered. "He's coming." Black smoke curled from his mouth, and then his body dissolved into shadow. Willen lowered the sword, chest heaving. Evelyn moved to his side. "That wasn't the Shadow King," Willen said. Evelyn's hand brushed his arm. "No," she said quietly, "but he's close." Willen's gaze lingered on the empty throne, the shadows curling along the floor. "We need to end this," Willen said. Evelyn's eyes sharpened. "Then we take the fight to him." The battlefield stretched wide and empty beneath the dark sky. The wind carried the distant sound of war horns, and the earth trembled beneath the march of armored feet. Beyond the ridge, the Shadow King's army gathered in a vast black tide. Thousands of twisted figures clad in dark iron, their banners stained with smoke and blood. Willen stood at the head of Avaloria's army. His fingers curled around the hilt of the silver flame. The blade pulsed softly, runes flickering silver beneath the twilight. Behind him, a line of knights and soldiers stood at attention, their banners rustling in the cold breeze. The steel of their armor caught the dying light of the sun. Evelyn stood at his side, longbow in hand. Goran the half-giant towered nearby, gripping a warhammer the size of a small tree. Alric the fox leaned on the hilt of his curved blade, his expression calm beneath the hood of his cloak. "They have the numbers," Evelyn said quietly. "They always do," Willen replied. Goran's dark eyes narrowed. "And the Shadow King?" "Still hiding," Alric said. His grin didn't reach his eyes. Cowards let their armies bleed first. Willen's gaze drifted toward the far ridge. Beyond the ranks of dark-armored soldiers, a figure sat astride a black warhorse, a figure clad in black steel. Edric. His crimson cloak rippled behind him as he watched from his horse. His pale eyes glinted beneath the dark helm. Willen's jaw tightened. "They'll attack soon," Evelyn said. Willen nodded. "Good." The attack began with a sound like rolling thunder. The Shadow King's front line surged forward, black banners snapping as the enemy ranks closed in. Arrows screamed through the air. Shields clashed. The first line of Avalorian knights braced their spears as the enemy crashed into them. "Hold the line!" Willen shouted. His horse reared beneath him as he raised the silver flame. Light flared along the blade's edge, casting a pale glow across the battlefield. The enemy pushed hard. Dark-armored figures with jagged blades hacked at shields and cut down knights. Willen saw a knight fall beneath the swing of a black axe, his helm crushed. He drove his heels into his horse's sides and surged forward. The first enemy soldier turned toward him, a hulking figure in black steel with a jagged sword. Willen met the blow with the silver flame. The light pulsed, bright, fierce, and the black sword shattered on contact. Willen's blade swept cleanly through the soldier's armor. The dark figure dissolved into smoke. Another enemy rushed him from the side, but Evelyn's arrow struck the soldier's throat, dropping him before he reached Willen. "To the left!" she shouted. Goran charged into the fray, his war hammer swinging. He crushed one soldier beneath its weight and sent another flying into the mud. Alric ducked beneath a spear thrust and drove his dagger into the back of an enemy's neck. "Forward!" Willen shouted. The knights of Avaloria rallied behind him. They pushed forward, cutting through the enemy ranks. Light flared with every strike of the silver flame. And then the battlefield trembled. A wave of black fire swept across the front line, searing the ground and sending Avalorian knights sprawling. Dark smoke curled from the earth. A figure stepped through the smoke, tall, cloaked in black steel, his face hidden beneath a shadowed helm. His sword, long, thin, and carved with red runes, dripped with black fire. The Shadow King. The battlefield fell silent. Willen dismounted, sword in hand. His boots sank into the mud as he stepped forward to meet the figure. The Shadow King's helm lifted slightly. "You wield the flame," the king said, his voice low and cold, "but it will not save you." Willen's chest tightened. He raised the silver flame. "We'll see." The Shadow King moved faster than Willen expected. Black steel clashed against silver light. The force of the blow sent Willen sliding back through the mud. He recovered, just as the king's sword came down in a brutal arc. Willen blocked, but the impact jarred his arms to the bone. A kick caught him in the chest and sent him sprawling into the dirt. The Shadow King's sword hovered at his throat. "I see why it chose you," the king said, "but you are still unworthy." The sword pressed down, and Willen screamed as black fire burned against his skin. "Willen!" Evelyn's voice. A silver arrow streaked through the air, but the Shadow King knocked it aside without effort. Willen's breath came shallow. He could feel the silver flame's light flickering beneath his grip, weakening. "The light will rise from the last blood." The Shadow King's sword came down. Willen's eyes narrowed. He gritted his teeth, and instead of dodging, he raised the silver flame toward the black blade. Light exploded between them. Silver and black fire twisted together, blindingly bright. The runes along the silver flame pulsed. Willen's body burned with heat, but he pushed forward. The Shadow King's sword splintered. The dark figure stumbled back. Willen stood, chest heaving. The silver flame blazed in his hand. Its light pulsed through his veins. He could feel it now. The truth of the blade, the power beneath it. He was not holding it. He was it. The Shadow King raised his broken sword, but Willen struck first. The silver flame cut through black steel and dark flesh. The Shadow King screamed, a sound that echoed across the battlefield. Black smoke poured from beneath his helm as his body collapsed into the dirt. Silence followed. Willen stood over the remains of the Shadow King. His breath fogged the cold air. The light of the silver flame slowly dimmed, flickering soft and steady. A cheer rose from the Avalorian knights. The enemy forces broke and scattered. Willen turned toward the ridge. Edric still sat astride his horse. His gaze was hard, calculating. And then, slowly, he turned and rode away, disappearing into the mist. Willen stood before the king's throne 2 days later. His armor had been cleaned, but his body still ached from the battle. The silver flame rested at his side. The king's gaze was steady. "You have done what no knight before you could. You wield the silver flame, and you have earned its place." He knelt before Willen and extended a sword. "Kneel." Willen hesitated. Then he knelt. "I name you Willen of House Markal," the king said, "Knight of the Silver Flame, protector of Avaloria." The sword tapped his shoulder. Willen rose. Evelyn stood near the edge of the hall. She gave him a small smile. Willen touched the hilt of the silver flame. Its light pulsed beneath his hand. And somehow he knew. This was only the beginning. Willen stood at the edge of the cliffs overlooking the sea. The salt spray clung to his skin as the dark waves crashed below. Evelyn stepped beside him. "Does it feel different?" she asked. Willen's hand brushed the hilt of the silver flame. Its light pulsed softly beneath his grip. "Yes," he said, "but it's not over." A dark shape stirred on the horizon. Evelyn's gaze sharpened. "No," she agreed, "it's not." The great hall of Camelot was alive with music and laughter. Fires roared in the massive stone hearths, casting flickering light upon the high, vaulted ceilings and the faces of knights and nobles alike. The long wooden tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, and golden goblets brimming with wine. The sweet sound of lutes and harps mingled with the low hum of conversation and the occasional burst of hearty laughter. King Arthur sat at the high table, a golden crown resting upon his brow. Beside him sat Queen Guinevere, resplendent in a gown of pale blue silk, her golden hair woven with pearls. To Arthur's left sat Sir Lancelot, his bright armor polished to a mirror sheen. On Arthur's right sat Sir Gawain, younger than most of the knights, but noble and brave in bearing. He had the sharp jawline of his mother, Morgause, and the thoughtful eyes of his father, Lot of Orkney. Arthur stood, raising his goblet. The hall quieted as he spoke. "Let us toast to the glory of Camelot," he said, his voice carrying through the high rafters. "May our honor never falter, and may the gods keep the light of truth burning in our hearts." "Aye!" the knights roared, raising their goblets. But before Arthur could sit, a low creaking sound echoed through the hall, the great wooden doors at the far end slowly opening. A bitter wind swept through the hall, extinguishing several torches. The music died, the laughter ceased. The figure that stepped into the hall was like no man they had ever seen. He was tall, at least 7 feet, broad-shouldered and powerful. His skin was the deep green of moss and ivy, and his hair flowed down his back in tangled locks like forest vines. He wore a tunic of deep green trimmed with gold, and in his hand he carried an axe so massive that no mortal man could hope to lift it. The blade gleamed darkly in the firelight, and the haft was twisted oak wrapped in iron. The Green Knight smiled faintly as he stepped into the center of the hall. "Peace, my lords," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "I come not to bring harm, but to offer a game." Several knights rose to their feet, hands at their sword hilts. "A game?" Lancelot growled. The Green Knight's smile widened. His bright green eyes gleamed unnervingly in the torchlight. "A simple game of courage and honor," he said. "Here is my challenge. Let any knight among you strike me down with this axe, but in 1 year's time that knight must seek me out at the Green Chapel and allow me to return the blow in kind." Murmurs ran through the hall. Some knights chuckled nervously. Others looked at each other in confusion. "Madness," whispered Sir Bedivere. King Arthur stood slowly, his brow furrowing. "You expect us to strike you down in cold blood?" The Green Knight's smile never wavered. "I expect you to show your courage." Sir Lancelot rose. "No honor is found in murdering an unarmed guest." "Ah," said the Green Knight, "but I am not unarmed." He planted the axe into the stone floor with a sharp crack. "Who will accept my challenge?" The room fell into heavy silence. Then Sir Gawain stood. "I will," he said. Arthur turned toward him. "Gawain." "I am the least of your knights," Gawain said, stepping toward the Green Knight, "and yet I will meet this challenge for the honor of Camelot." The Green Knight's eyes gleamed approvingly. "Then kneel," he said. The Green Knight handed the great axe to Gawain, who was surprised at how easily it sat in his grip. It was heavy, yes, but balanced. The Green Knight knelt before him, bowing his head and parting the long green hair from his neck. "Strike true, Sir Gawain," he said. Gawain hesitated for a moment. Then he raised the axe high. "May the gods forgive me," he murmured, and he brought the axe down. The blade sliced cleanly through the Green Knight's neck. His head rolled across the floor and came to rest at Arthur's feet. A gasp swept through the hall, but then the Green Knight's body rose. The headless body walked across the floor, reached down, and picked up its head by the hair. The severed face opened its eyes. The lips twisted into a smile. "1 year hence," the Green Knight's head said, "you will seek me at the Green Chapel, or be branded a coward. And then the Green Knight's body strode from the hall, head in hand. The door slammed shut behind. Gawain set out from Camelot at dawn, riding alone beneath a cold winter sky. His horse, Gringolet, moved steadily beneath him as he passed through frost-bitten fields and into the dark woods beyond the castle's borders. The chill of the season bit into his face, but Gawain pressed forward, his thoughts fixed on the promise he had made. Autumn turned to winter. Snow began to gather beneath Gringolet's hooves as Gawain crossed frozen rivers and climbed rocky hills. He rode through silent villages where thin-faced peasants watched him from behind shuttered windows. He asked after the Green Chapel, but no one knew of such a place. Some crossed themselves at the mention of the Green Knight's name, others warned him to turn back. Gawain ignored them. His word had been given. He would see this through. One evening, as dusk settled over the land, Gawain came upon a narrow path leading into a dense forest. The skeletal branches of the trees reached overhead, forming a tunnel of shadows. Gringolet hesitated at the edge of the path, snorting softly. "It's all right," Gawain murmured, stroking the horse's neck. "We go on." He pressed forward into the gloom. The forest closed around them, swallowing the last light of the setting sun. Gawain's breath formed pale clouds in the frigid air. Suddenly, movement in the trees. Gawain drew his sword. A low growl echoed through the darkness. A pair of amber eyes opened ahead of him, followed by the hulking shape of a massive black wolf. It stepped into the path, its fangs bared. Gawain held his ground. "If you seek to stop me," he said softly, "you will have to kill me." The wolf lunged. Gawain sidestepped and brought his sword down in a clean arc. The blade struck the beast's flank, but the wolf vanished, dissolving into a wisp of smoke. Gawain stood frozen, his sword still raised. Then, from the shadows, a low laugh. A figure emerged from the trees, tall and robed in green. His face was hidden beneath a deep hood. "You show courage," the figure said. His voice was smooth, calm. "But courage alone will not see you through this trial." Gawain lowered his sword. "Are you the Green Knight?" "No," the figure said. "But he is waiting for you. Ride north at dawn. The Green Chapel lies beyond the next valley." Before Gawain could speak, the figure stepped back into the shadows and was gone. Gawain sheathed his sword and led Gringolet through the forest. His heart was steady, but the weight of his promise pressed heavier on his chest with each passing step. At dawn, he rode toward the valley, toward the Green Chapel, and toward whatever fate awaited him.